So I think we'll go ahead and get started. People will join us when they come in. Good evening. This is Keisha Rogers, and I want to welcome you to our Monday night strategic discussion and overview. I'll be joined tonight by Tony Pappert. Today is October 24th, and we are only days away from the most decisive election day 2022 on November 8th. As many of you, there's many of you who probably have already started working elections as poll watchers, as early vote counters, early vote workers. And I know today here in Texas, we just started early voting on today. And I want to start with, first of all, before I turn it over to Tony, whose theme is going to be on the Third American Revolution, and really taking up this question of the type of identity that has to emerge within the population to secure victory, not just for the election, but what's going to be needed to be understood in terms of the policies that have to be set into motion, how we're actually going to implement a true America First policy for the nation, and putting our families, putting our children first. And this is what President Trump really exemplified when we attended, and those of you who had an opportunity to watch his rally here in Texas, where he came to the southern border area in Texas, near Corpus Christi in Robstown, a number of our LaRouche PAC associates and organizers had an opportunity to attend that rally. And not only did we attend, but we were there with the solutions that are absolutely necessary to ensure a red wave and victory in this upcoming election, and to talk to people about what was it that is on the minds of the American people. What are they concerned about? And as many of you know, what we gathered from people is what we're seeing across the board in terms of people saying they've had enough with the inflation. The massive inflation is killing them. They're unable to afford basic standards of living, that people have to pay enormous prices for food, for gas. So we know that this is impacting people. And at the same time, what are the Democrats concerned about? As we've said before, things that do not matter to the American people. They're concerned about continuing to push endless wars, to get the United States into a war with Russia over Ukraine, to get us into the brink of nuclear war. People are saying, why is this the direction of the Democrats? Or they're concerned that the Democrats' concern in the leadership right now is how to put insane subpoenas and sanctions on President Trump. And when they're not addressing the fact that our borders are being run over by massive cartels, by fentanyl, by swarms of illegal immigrants coming through. And the thing that we saw, and we'll discuss this a bit more, but when speaking with participants in the rally, is that a number of people recognize that the biggest threat and concern facing the American people is the economy. And as many of you know, this has created a massive shift coming from the Democrats, coming from former Democrats who have left the Democrat Party, such as everyone knows, Tulsi Gabbard, who is now out campaigning across the nation, recently campaigning for Trump-endorsed candidate Carrie Lake. She also campaigned recently for a number of other Republican America First candidates. And today she actually spoke and put forth that she was speaking for the children and going against the mutilation of children, this gender politics, as you will read in a recent post that Barbara Boyd put up, where she identified just this massive movement underway. And we talked about, for example, what we saw and experienced in Michigan at a recent rally, at a recent school board meeting, where thousands of parents came out and were telling us directly, I will never vote for a Democrat again in my life, that what they're doing to our children, what they're doing to our future, this has to be stopped. And so you see this coming from all different ethnicities, from the Muslim community, from the Black community, from so many others who have left the Democratic Party and its atrocious policies and actions against our nation. Now, you have the solution that they think they have to stopping the red wave that's growing is by bringing in the atrocious, notorious, infamous Barack Obama. Now, if they think that bringing Barack Obama back on the scene and sending him into the battleground states, and Obama is saying that, telling the Democrats, you're going to lose this if you don't stop talking about Donald Trump and if you don't stop talking about January 6th. Well, he's right about that, but they're going to lose anyway, because the Democrats and the uniparty of the warmongering Republicans, the neocons, and the joint forces of the Democrats and the uniparty as a whole have no strategy and no solutions. And the growing MAGA movement is growing, America First movement. And as Trump said, MAGA is not just the slogan. This is the battle cry. This is Make America Great Again. But the question is that as we go into the elections, I can tell you now, I would like to hear from people who are working the elections. It's going to be, as has been stated in this recent article, which I want to pull up here quickly from Barbara Boyd, where she identifies the sweep of the red wave that's going on across the country, in Nevada, in Arizona, in Michigan, in Georgia, where candidates, America First, Trump candidates, Trump endorsed candidates are in very close margins, and most of the time they're leading in these elections. But the question becomes whether or not, as she said, the Republicans have enough eyes on the ground and ears on the ground to prevent vote fraud, and whether patriotic Americans will turn out in the overwhelming numbers necessary to defeat whatever fraud and October surprise the Democrats have in place. So they're already going for it right now. We see this here. There's reports of jams in the election machines when ballots are going on. There's reports of all different types of operations. So the question is, we can't get demoralized. We can't sit back and say, we'll see, wait and see what's going to happen. We actually have to be prepared to lead and to fight, and to ensure that we have a massive turnout on November 8th. And I think what is quite fitting is, as reported in this report, that they can bring out Obama all they want to, but that's a losing strategy, because the universe is aligned toward truth. And I thought it was quite fitting that in the article that Barbara writes here, that she emphasizes that on November 8th, for the first time in 3 years, we're going to have a total lunar eclipse. And this is going to result in a red moon. And this is when you have the moon, Earth, and the sun aligned at one time, and the moon passes over the Earth, creating an umbra, which creates a hue of basically of a red moon. And it's very ironic and very appropriate that at a time when everything seems chaotic, you see ordering in the principles of our solar system and our universe. And I think that we have to bring about that order going into the November 8th election and ensure a massive red wave with the red moon for a red victory, and and to make sure. And the interesting thing is that the next eclipse will take place in March of 2025, long after President Trump will have already taken the White House back again after this massive victory in November 2022. So with that, I want to turn it over, and we'll hear more reports and get to more discussion later, but I want to turn it over to Tony to really identify what's required in the understanding of you, the citizenry. Okay.
We're standing immediately before a turning point in history, which is exactly 2 weeks and 1 day away. Nobody knows what's going to happen on November 8th or November 9th, just as nobody knew what was going to happen in the election of 2016, and nobody knew what was going to happen in the election of 2020, which led to this, which led to the creation of this extraordinary MAGA movement, which is building and growing and fighting the election today. And again, nobody knows what will happen in 2 weeks and 1 day, except we do know that we're going to deepen and broaden this unprecedented MAGA movement for the third American Revolution. And that's going to be the thrust of what I'm going to discuss for the next few minutes, is the third American Revolution, which we're at the beginning of right now. So, I mean, you've studied history. You know that, especially from 1763, with the end of what was called in the US the French and Indian Wars, the British Empire moved to revoke our colonial charters, to abrogate our rights, to snuff out our freedoms, including, very importantly, our economic freedoms of trade and manufacture. They sought to outlaw numerous kinds of manufacture in America. And this is what our founders called, in the Declaration of Independence, a long train of usurpations. And we've studied it. We were only able to preserve our rights as Englishmen, and we were not merely Englishmen, but representatives of the best of European civilization, mostly English and not exclusively, who had come here to the New World, where the best of European civilization could be cultivated without, away from the oligarchs, aristocrats, financier aristocrats of the old world, of Europe. We could only preserve our rights through revolution. And we went further, of course, than merely preserving the rights we had. We did what had never been done in human history. We created a nation on the basis of true human nature, the true human nature described in the Declaration of Independence, in the preamble of the Constitution, and in Genesis, among other locations, chapters 126 to 128. Man as a creative, intellectual nature in the image and likeness of God, the Creator, as it's expressed in our founding documents. But, from the beginning, the British Empire was not reconciled to our existence as a nation set up against them in behalf of a totally adverse conception of man and God to that of that empire. And they set out to destroy us from the first day. They used many means. And eventually, by the middle of the 19th century, working through their Southern slaveholder class, which were dependents on London and the British Empire, working through also radical abolitionists in New England and other northern states. The British had brought us to the point where they could foresee a splintering of our country into numerous, or at least two, but probably ultimately more, petty principalities which could not withstand the British Empire, which would be manipulated by the empire and taken over once again, which was their objective, and which has been their continuing objective through today, even if using different forms. So they thought they could destroy us in a civil war, secession, breakup of the Union, and we saved our nation and our principle for the world through what many, including Lyndon LaRouche, have called a second American Revolution in the Civil War, about which, of course, Lincoln said, as you all know, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, which I think we could consider today really a second American Revolution, a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not vanish from the earth. Now, today, we have come to the point again, after decades of long trains of usurpations, after decades of imperial overreach, we've come to the point where now a third American Revolution is necessary to preserve the gains of the first American Revolution, a new rebirth of freedom. And that, as Lincoln said, that government of the people, by the people, for the people shall not vanish from the earth. Now, the long train of usurpations, which destroyed us, or almost destroyed us, in the decades before 2016, has really been the story of my life. And it's hard for me to see it otherwise. I was there virtually. I was born a few weeks later when President Truman, Vice President Truman, took over from the dead Franklin Roosevelt and reversed Franklin Roosevelt's whole policy to a pro-British Empire policy. Roosevelt had envisaged and had planned that after the war, the nations which were then colonies, which were a large part of the Earth's population, would become not only free nations, but would develop industry through an international system, his conception of the Bretton Woods system, in which the United States would convert its great industries of war, the greatest industrial machine that had ever been built, which was built up here in the United States to arm ourselves and our allies for World War II. Roosevelt envisaged that military might, military industrial might, would be converted to a great capital export industry, and that the nations of the earth would be industrialized by American capital, building up the prosperity of the United States and our neighbors in the Southern Hemisphere and our friends in Africa and in Asia, in a huge world development plan of mutual prosperity. Roosevelt had actually rehearsed this before the war in his good neighbor policy toward Central and South America, which created the steel industry of Brazil, which is still a remarkable achievement today, built up by Brazil in cooperation with Roosevelt in the 30s. So this was what Roosevelt envisaged for after the war, totally opposite to the view of the arch British imperialist Winston Churchill. And Churchill, of course, was happy when Roosevelt died, came over here, took over Truman, and the American might, which had been used to build the war, was dismantled, except for a small part, which was aimed toward consumer goods. the US went from a great, implicitly capital export technological power, even if it was, for war industry during the war years. The US went from an implicit great power of capital export to a consumer fad economy with, cars which changed their tail fins every few years and had to be taken back to the lot to be traded in. So, and then Roosevelt came over here, Churchill came over here and at Fulton, Missouri, tutored Truman in how to launch the Cold War. Again, Roosevelt, was no communist. He was no communist sympathizer. He had no illusions about Joseph Stalin, but he had foreseen at the end of the war that we could maintain a relationship as we had during the war, despite the fact that we abhorred the system of government in the Soviet Union at that time. So that was the beginning of the betrayal of the hopes of many of the American soldiers in World War II. And that was the time of my birth. And years later, decades later, I was there in 1963 when John Kennedy was shot in Dealey Plaza. Thereafter, Martin Luther King in Memphis. Thereafter, Bobby Kennedy, California, in 68. And these were great men. And they had launched great projects and great movements. But what's also has to be noted is that in the state of our moral stepping down from what we had been during World War II, no one stepped forward to take John Kennedy's place. No one stepped forward to take Martin Luther King's place, Bobby Kennedy's place. Instead, people shrunk back. I was there when we went to the moon in 1969, and the program, of course, begun by John Kennedy in 1961. But I was there later, as perhaps unbeknownst to many of you, when the dies used to make the Saturn V rocket, which took us to the moon all those times, the dies used to manufacture the Saturn V were destroyed to ensure that no Saturn V could ever be made again, and that the United States would not return to the moon, which, but for Donald Trump, we would not return to the moon again. I was there when Nixon made the fatal blunder of August 15th, 1971, and destroyed the Bretton Woods monetary system, which had been established by Franklin Roosevelt in 1945. The Bretton Woods system never fulfilled the program for it which Roosevelt had envisaged completely, but the Bretton Woods system did function for the restoration of the economies of Western Europe, Japan, and the greatest period of prosperity for these parts of the world for the post-war decades, maybe 30 years of the post-war decades. Nixon was convinced by British agents within his government to pull the plug. And as a result, the US dollar, which had been the foundation of the Bretton Woods system, was replaced by the euro dollar, which was the London dollar, which was dollars created in London. So that most dollars today are created outside of the United States, in London, or even more so in offshore British locations like the Cayman Islands, which is the headquarters, I believe, for 8,000 hedge funds. I was there when Glass-Steagall, the Roosevelt bank protection, one of the first things he did on coming to office in 1933 was sever speculative investment banking from commercial banking, so that the speculative investments of the investment bankers could never again be used to cannibalize the deposits of citizens and businesses in commercial banks. deposits which are guaranteed since Roosevelt by the federal government, so that the speculation gobbles up not just the deposits, but the federal guarantees. This was tragically repealed by Bill Clinton in 1999, again under British influence, and resulted in the orgy of financialization of this, it was already going on, but resulted in the culmination of the financialization of our whole economy worldwide, leading to the 2008 crash, from which we've still never exited. And the fact that we've never exited from that crash, and we've gone from the crash into orgies of bailout money printing to bail out of the crash, is now being revealed as the Federal Reserve tries to raise interest rates, resulting in crashes like the one maybe 2 weeks ago in London, bringing down the monetary system once again, as in 2008. So briefly said, this train of usurpations from 1945, and then, as you see, increasing in seriousness and frequency, has again virtually destroyed our country by the time we got to 2016, as President Trump said. The subsequent events, beginning with Trump's election in 2016, the other events I've described, the election in 2020, the citizen movement, which has now grown and taken on a deep character of responsibility for the country, are aspects of this third American Revolution, which is now underway. We're seeing an entirely different moral character among many Americans from anything we've seen in the recent decades. This is maybe obvious to you without further discussion, but you can imagine a Senate to be elected, this year. A third of the Senate will be elected this year. You can imagine the Senate, which will take office in January of next year. There may be a majority. I tend to think there will be a majority of Republicans. There will be many stalwart MAGA Trump supporters among the senators, some number of them. But numbers are no longer simply numbers. We're going to have a different character of people in the Senate, people who are not politicians, people who have not joined the Senate simply to join the upper 1% of wealth, which is the reason most people have joined the Senate in recent years. People who have joined the Senate for reasons which they would rather die than give up. We'll have senators of that sort, which is what a senator is supposed to be, among the other senators. So regardless of the balance of numbers in the Senate, the balance of the Senate will not simply be determined by the balance of numbers. You're going to have a difference in quality. In some of the MAGA senators that we are going to elect now, from any senators who have been there for many, many years. Totally different kind of person. It's the soldier who will fight to the last. We're going to have that in the Senate, some of the senators, and their influence is going to be far out of proportion to their numbers. So we're entering a totally different kind of period. I think I have some time to take up one other aspect of it, which is the following, which is Europe. Those of you who have been reading our articles on the website or perhaps other material, you're aware that the things which are killing us here, the green catastrophe, the green idolatry, the stripping down our energy, shutting off fossil fuels, outlawing automobiles, meaning most of our country under this kind of regime, this kind of imperial rule, most of our country will not be mobile. They'll be stuck in their homes. Maybe they can ride a bicycle because gasoline cars will be outlawed and electric cars will be unaffordable. So, and you know, the rises in electric bills, gasoline at the pump that you're suffering, Europe is suffering this tenfold. I mean, as of now, under this insane boycott of Russian energy, under the insane green policy, which Europe has been following for years, like Biden, Europeans, elderly people are going to be freezing to death in Europe this winter if these policies continue. And Europe, if things continue in this way, Europe will cease to exist as a center of European culture, which is our culture. And now, admittedly, the Europeans don't have the means that we as Americans have to resist this. They don't have sovereign nations over them, just as we foresaw. That's why our forefathers came here, because they foresaw vaguely this sort of mess in Europe. After repeated wars, countries which have suffered repeated foreign occupations, they're nothing but vassals of the so-called European Union, which is nothing but the British Empire. So they don't have the ability to resist. Nevertheless, or they don't have the ability to resist, which we do. Nevertheless, the loss of Europe as a center of European science, technology, and culture, for all its problems, would be catastrophic for the world. At the same time, the economic collapse, which Biden and the imperialists are pushing, is destroying Africa. It's destroying Central and South America. It's destroying parts of Asia as well. So there's a world catastrophe, and the European aspect of it, I think, is particularly important for reasons of the importance still today of the cultural contribution of Europe. But we can change that. We as Americans can change that. Our first American Revolution in the 1700s was tremendously, despite the bloody farce which the French Revolution became, which was designed to forever abort the possibility of an American-style revolution in Europe. Despite that, our revolution had tremendous effects in Europe, and tremendous positive effects. Our second, what I'm calling, and others do, our second American Revolution, our Civil War, our victory in our Civil War, triggered really a 19th century Renaissance in Europe. The science which we have today, I mean, the science, the technology, the physics, the theory of relativity, optics, the quantum, all these things which we might call 20th century science, they're the outcome of a 19th century Renaissance in Europe, triggered from here by our victory in the Civil War, which gave us, of course, in our country, Thomas Edison, manned flight, Henry Ford, modern mass production. It gave us a level of science and technology which was unparalleled in history, and a rate of human development in the 19th century, especially the late 19th century, which had never been seen in human history. And this is an outcome of our winning the fight here. And we're going to win the fight here again, and we're going to rescue Europe. Our country, which was a project of the great minds of Europe from the Renaissance, as I implied speaking earlier. I mean, the great minds of the Renaissance, for instance, in Italy, I mean, there was always the project to create an Italian nation. Great, it's before the Renaissance. Back in the 13th century, the greatest leaders of Italy wanted to create an Italian nation on the basis of the discoveries and rediscoveries of Christianity and Platonism, which laid the basis for Christianity. They always wanted to create an Italian nation. Amidst the oligarchies, the financier oligarchies and aristocracies of Europe, that was impossible. The Italian nation waited for its creation almost until the 20th century. So the great leaders of the Renaissance in Europe had the project of going outside the reach of the oligarchy, going outside the reach of what eventually became essentially the British Empire, going to a new location protected by wide oceans from the oligarchs to found a society in which man could truly be man in his original nature as God intended him to be. So our kind, this was achieved. It was achieved, more than that was achieved. The first ever founding of a new nation on that basis was achieved here. But the colonization of the New World was a European project. And what's going to happen in the coming years, as we've done in past centuries, is that we're going to return the favor. We're going to lend a helping hand to our friends in Europe, who are at the moment practically passing underneath the waves. So that's for intro, and I'd love to hear your questions and discussion and reports, because there's vibrant organizing going on throughout the country.